a collapse of Iran, it would be Iraq 10 times over.
The irony is precisely what was meant to unite the region in the interest of US imperialism has actually now drawn a line of conflict between the different allies of US imperialism.
Capitalism, this system that was supposed to civilize the entire planet, is causing the most horrific barbarism. Welcome to Against the Stream, the communist podcast which analyzes world events in order to reveal the true class interests that shape them. Because if you want to change the world, you need to understand it first. My name is Hamid Alizadeh, and I'm here today with my co-host, Ben Curry. Welcome back, Ben.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Pleasure to be here.
In today's show, the world is watching on to see whether America will attack Iran. Meanwhile, military conflict is brewing in the entire region, making it a powder keg waiting to explode. That'll be our main story for today. We'll also discuss the revolutionary implications of the Epstein case. And finally, a question from one of our readers who asks, are communists in favor of violence? We'll see about that when we get there.
To that.
But let's start with Iran. There has been, for the past month, more than a month, a massive military buildup outside of near Iran by America. I have here a list of military units, I guess. 2 aircraft carriers, 13 large surface combatant ships, 3 small surface combatant ships, and in total, there's more than 90 aircraft on those ships. More than 30 F-35s, more than 10 F-22s, which are designed to take down air defenses, more than 30 F-16s, more than 30 F-15s, more than 10 A-1s, and there are many more deployed in Europe, which can reach the area very quickly. A whole series of AWACS, which are these airborne warning and control systems, electronic warfare systems, I guess. 20 refueling tankers, so they can keep the jets going if they choose to conduct airstrikes. And of course, the America has 30 to 40,000 troops in the area, and many more. Trump calls it an armada, although an armada I think has very bad connotations because, as far as I remember, the Spanish armada
didn't end very well.
Was ingloriously defeated when it tried to attack Britain. But this is serious. Obviously, this is sending shockwaves around Iran. People are very worried. But the main question we have to answer to understand will there be war or not is, first of all, why is this happening? I think that's the first question that needs to be asked. We predicted, in fact, that after the war in June, that there would be another military conflict at some point in the near term. Because what happened was that war, the 12-day war, was an Israeli, an American war against Iran, a bombing campaign against Iran aimed at its nuclear capabilities. But in reality, none of the stated aims of that campaign were achieved. The main one, Trump said he'd obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. But now, in his State of the Union address, he says all he wants is for Iran to stop his nuclear program. Well, what is it then? Is it obliterated, or should they stop it? Obviously, they didn't manage to do anything more than temporary damage to that program. And furthermore, Iran, as a major military power, remains a missile power, which showed its capabilities in its ability to strike Israel. I believe 10,000 Israeli homes were damaged by Iranian strikes. And it was a massive shock to Israel, who's always portrayed itself as invincible. So I think that's number one reason, that the Israelis, and Netanyahu in particular, are determined to get rid of Iran, which is the main obstacle preventing Israel from almost unimpeded dominance, military dominance over, if not the entire, then huge parts of this region. Then there's a second one, which is Trump is obviously also being pulled in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about this national security document later on, but a part of the the Trump coalition of forces, we may say, is the people around people like J.D. Vance and so on, who are the isolationists, who are saying that we should, the America needs to retrench. In fact, as we're going to talk about later, in the national security document, they say that America needs to retrench after dealing with Iran, also from the Middle East. But there's also other wings there who are pulling him in a different direction, which is the old guard, you may say, who are connected to Marco Rubio, Mike Johnson, what's his name? Lindsey Graham.
Oh, yeah.
The old school neocon conservatives who are completely aligned with Netanyahu and who want to obliterate Iran as a power, as any sort of independent source forever. And they're obviously pushing him, and he's going at this coming out of Venezuela, where he feels that he succeeded. He had a flawless mission. We haven't seen the end of that mission, but in his mind, he comes up drunk on success, so to say, and they're telling him, look, you can do the same thing in Iran. But obviously, it's not the same. Iran is not Venezuela. Iran has a huge military capacity. It has, I think, more than 1 million men under arms. It has a whole series of defenses, not just military hardware, but also proxies and groups that it supports throughout the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, but also networks of influence in almost every single country. It has very strong, powerful missile capabilities and drone capabilities, as we've seen. It has the potential to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and petrochemicals trade, or petroleum trade, goes through, and also gas, by the way. And it could also destabilize countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all of these which have a very significant Shia minority and which are also very, very fragile in faced with the Iranian military threat. American bases, furthermore, 30 or 40,000 American troops are stationed in the region. These are all defenseless, essentially, against a powerful, overwhelming Iranian attack.
It's a big gamble.
It's a huge gamble. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of what Trump is saying, what he's formally saying the reasons are for this banging of the war drums, he's been completely incoherent. I mean, and it's quite clear that what he's talking about now, nuclear weapons, it's not the ultimate aim. I mean, a month ago, he was talking about defending the protesters. Now he doesn't say anything about that whatsoever. And now it's come out actually that there were machinations by the US to actually accelerate the collapse of the currency in Iran. But actually, I think they've miscalculated at how weak Iran is. I think, he's buoyed up on success in Venezuela. He saw these massive protests, and there was brutal repression, and there was genuine anger inside Iran towards this corrupt and rotten regime. But I think he thought it would just require a push, and then it would topple basically, or it would capitulate.
Yeah.
And I think in these protests, the point is actually the reason the regime didn't fall to a large extent is because people could see that actually the US and Israel in particular were heavily involved in they had people on the ground. Mossad bragged about having people on the ground.
Yeah.
And they've I think that what they're talking about now, they've stopped talking about the protests. They're talking about they've got to give up their nuclear enrichment, all nuclear enrichment, including for civilian use. They've got to give up their ballistic missiles. They've basically got to render themselves defenseless.
Yeah.
They've got to capitulate.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Steve Witkoff, the US envoy who's been involved in the negotiations in Geneva, he said of the Trump administration that they're actually quite confused. And he said, I don't want to say the word capitulate, but why haven't they capitulated?
Of the Iranians, you mean?
The Iranians, yeah. The Trump administration thought they were going to capitulate.
Yeah.
You bring enough pressure to bear.
Yeah.
You saw what happened in Venezuela. And in fact, far from having capitulated, the hardline wing is preparing. They've actually learned a lesson from the 12-day war last year, which was if you keep going soft and you show restraint, which the Iranians have done throughout the whole of the Gaza war and the 12-day war, they held back and they held back. But now they realize this is about regime change.
Yeah.
They're not going to stop until they get regime change. So it's certainly the Israelis and a certain wing of the neocons in the United States.
I mean, in Iran, there are different factions of the ruling class in Iran. The president, in fact, is of the reformist liberal faction, which is very open to the West. But the point is that that's not a very popular thing, because people see what is the West going to give us? As you were right, there were popular protests in Iran last month. They were quite widespread, and there is widespread dissatisfaction with the regime as a whole. But you see, the regime still have some support, but the Americans have no support whatsoever. And all of this thing, what kind of, there's no regime with American support that could come in and have any sort of popular support on the ground in Iran, which is strengthening the hands of the Khamenei wing, the hardline wing, if you may, who are saying, what is Trump demanding from us? He's demanding we give up our nuclear enrichment program, we give up our missile capabilities, we give up supporting these groups in other places in the region. Well, that will just make us like Iraq. And what happened to Iraq? And what happened to Afghanistan? What happened to Libya? These were regimes or countries which didn't have anything to resist with, and they were overthrown. And what is the result? Is absolute barbarism.
They say that they accuse Iran of wanting nuclear weapons. Well, the one way to encourage them to get nuclear weapons is to continuously threaten them with regime change. I mean, I remember back after 9/11, you had the axis of evil, of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, accused of trying to get weapons of mass destruction. When North Korea got nuclear weapons, they stopped talking about regime change in North Korea.
Yeah, so the regime doesn't want to backtrack. They have no interest in backtracking. No. And that has left Trump in a bit of a bind, because I mean, every expert on the planet who has something to say, just the slightest level of honesty, will tell you that this war will not be easy. Iran is a very, very strong adversary for America to engage with. It will not achieve any of their aims by aerial campaign. So that will leave them humiliated. That would leave them with a defeat de facto. But if they actually go in deeper in order to reassert themselves and double down like they're constantly doing, that the Americans have done the entire time, well, the past many, many decades, they risk being sucked into another forever war. You're going to see oil markets being disrupted. You're going to see the whole world economy, being pushed to the brink. Massive amounts of instability in the entire region, and mission creep is what they called in Vietnam, which is the Americans being sucked into a long-drawn war, which no one in America has any appetite for. So here is Trump's dilemma. He's puffed up his chest. He's moved his so-called armada there, and now the Iranians won't budge. Then he's got a few options. Trita Parsi, who's one of the more decent and intelligent commentators on Iran, he said, well, there's been reports that Trump asked the Iranian regime to kind of allow him to strike somewhere, and then they could strike somewhere else. That's not causing too much damage, and then he could withdraw. But the Iranians said, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to accept anything. Which means that the option before him is make a deal with Iran, which would, go to war with Iran, which would end badly.
Yes. And
we'll get to how badly it could get in a minute. Or make a deal with Iran, which is exactly what Trump promised not to do.
Yeah.
Because this deal would be the same as the deal that Obama did, that Trump ripped apart, which is the same as the deal that Trump rejected last year. And if he takes that, he is going to be met with a barrage of attacks from his own camp, from the same neocons who are now pushing him to charge on, right? So he's in a position where he can't get it right. There's no good way for him. The American public, by the way, is not in favor of it. If you want to go to war, you need to have you need to have public support. In Venezuela, however incredibly and unbelievably, he tried to come up with this thing that, oh, there was a narco cartel and narco trafficking is a big problem for America. What's the threat in Iran? He's now going out saying, oh, they're developing a missile that can hit America. That's not true. And America could shoot it down 1,000,000 times before any missile from Iran could reach America. It's not really believable. And the majority of Americans, there's a YouGov poll from the 23rd of February, which says that only 27% of people at this point support a war, an attack on Iran. Only 57% of Republicans. Now you might think 57%, that's the majority, but it's only the majority of the people who are Republicans, which is not necessarily the majority itself of the country, which means that he's going to lose a third of his popular support just off the bat. And then once the crisis begins unraveling and once the impact starts setting in, this could have severe repercussions. The Iraq War, when the Americans went into Iraq, had massive support on the back of the shock of the 9/11 attacks. And that turned into a massive political crisis and huge mass opposition to war. This one will be 1,000,000 times worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, Trump is drunk on success after what happened in Venezuela. I thought if he applies enough military pressure, then some sort of crack would open up. But now, he's left only with bad options. From the point of view of US imperialism, it will be an enormous blow to the prestige, with enormous repercussions throughout the whole region if they retreat now without a deal. But like you say, the only deal that's available at this point is going to be the Obama deal.
Yeah,
I think, there's a situation now where, they're faced with no good options whatsoever. And this has enormous implications back home in the United States. He was the peace president. The whole point of we could get away with the Venezuela question because on the one hand, it seemed to be over quickly, sharp operation. And he could sell it as, look, we've got this Venezuelan oil. It's going to bring prices down, inflation down, all of this sort of thing, all of these sort of things. This is what really concerns Americans. Even in the 12-day war, one short, sharp operation, and now we've ended that war. He's sold himself as the peace president who ends wars because since the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, that started with enormous patriotism and national fervor and what have you, to go in on this war on terror and show American power all around the world. And that ended in a catastrophe and has led to the situation where there is this record, record low support for these continuous adventures. And now they want to prepare another adventure. It's obviously going to have immediately it's exposing the real nature of the Trump administration, which is an imperialist administration with an imperialist policy like all other administrations.
Yeah.
But then there is the long-term impact, and not even the long-term, the economic impact, I should say. Yeah. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the energy prices go through the roof. The American economy is already on a precipice. A huge amount of the growth, which is taking place in the United States, is on a speculative basis. You have this enormous AI bubble. One shock could pop that, and
not to speak of inflation.
Yeah,
I mean, one of the inflation was one of the key elements for Trump's election, and is one of the most unpopular areas where Trump is most unpopular. It is the area where he's the most unpopular, and higher oil prices are not going to help that. But I would say, just kind of finishing on the last bit before we continue, if they succeed in their very vaguely determined aims, you would actually have the worst of all situations. Because what you see is what they're talking about, a decapitation strike, right? Taking out of the regime. First of all, this regime is very strong. It's not a weak regime. It's a complicated and strong regime, whether you like it or not. It's not going to be easy to take it down, and it does have some popular support. But let's say that you succeed in taking it out. What it would leave it would be first of all, inside of the country, an enormous political vacuum and the potential unraveling of Iran with a situation which would be far more reactionary and barbaric than what we saw in Iraq and in Syria and in Afghanistan after the invasions of those countries. It could lead to total social collapse, civil wars that could last for decades, different powers trying to move in, refugee flows going to all sorts of, throughout the region. That is what Israel wants, by the way. That is openly what the Israelis want.
Weaken Iran by destroying it.
Weaken Iran by destroying it, by dividing it up in different parts. But it would also leave a huge vacuum in the region. We saw after the invasion of Iraq, the entire region was thrown into incredible turmoil because of the power vacuum that was left after the collapse of the Iraqi army. Yes. Suddenly, Iran became a military power in the region, and it clashed with the Saudis, it clashed with the Turks, it clashed with the Israelis, and it took a while. I mean, we have, in fact, what we have now is a certain equilibrium reached after a decade of, or more than a decade of very, very tumultuous situation. A collapse of Iran would have even worse. It would be Iraq 10 times over. Just like it would be Iraq 10 times over domestically in the US, it would be Iraq 10 times over as a consequence for the entire region. It would mean that Israel would be unchallenged in a huge number of theaters, so to say, and it would pit Israel against other powers such as Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Which is why they are opposed to this.
Yes.
The Saudis have come out, the Turks have come out against Trump taking military action. One, because they fear that American bases on their territories would become targets. Their restive Shia populations could be activated by the Iranians. They could become military targets.
Yes.
But even more so because it would lead to this kind of vacuum. What do you call, like when there's a vacuum and the space swirls around it?
I don't know, some sort of
vortex. Yeah. That's the situation that we're in. And it would have profoundly reactionary consequences for the entire world, and of course for the peoples of the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're actually seeing now is that. And incidentally, all of these, Israel, the Saudis, Egypt, Turkey, they're all American allies, formally speaking. But what we're seeing now, I think, because of the destabilization of the equilibrium across the region, which is already in progress, whatever happens in Iran, America's going to come out of this weakened. It's going to be exposed, I think, is the most likely outcome. You have a situation where... the events after 7th of October have destabilized things enormously. Israel has been pumped with weapons. It's been given a blank check by Biden and Trump, incidentally. It's been able to bomb, never mind Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, beyond the Golan Heights and what have you. It's also been able to drop bombs on Qatar and get away with it, another American ally. And all of this, I think, has... and the potential for destabilization of Iran is alarming the other powers in the region. That precisely, America is 100% behind them, and there is now a new alignment.
Let's actually, because I think we should let's finish this because we have kind of two half segments here. Mm-hmm. One is Iran in and of itself, but let's move to. There's a new realignment of the situation taking place in the whole region. You've written an excellent article yesterday that I think everyone should read. We're going to link to it in the description. But maybe you can give us a brief overview. What's going on?
I'll start with how this began because from tiny. This is not really tiny insignificant events, but it didn't really hit the headlines initially. From these little events, a bigger chain of events is sort of unfolding. And what it's revealing is there are two hostile camps, both formerly comprised of US allies, that are forming in opposition to each other, that are militarizing, that are arming, and that are arming their proxies. And those tensions are very rapidly escalating, and they have been since December last year. One of the things that kicked it off was actually the conflict in Yemen. And the Yemen conflict has been going on for a long time, as have a whole number of other conflicts in Libya, in Syria. You have civil wars, conflicts, border conflicts all across the region that have either been provoked or encouraged, or petrol has been poured onto the flames of which by US imperialism. They created this barbarism in all of these different countries. So there is all of this going on. Yes, you had these events in Yemen at the start of this year. Actually, a couple of days after Maduro was kidnapped on the 3rd of January. On the 5th of January, you had a sudden incident in Yemen. What had happened is in Yemen, the Yemeni government is a proxy basically of the Saudis. And they've been on and off aligned with the Southern Transitional Council, another proxy group, which is actually a proxy of the United Arab Emirates. And in December, the Emirati-backed STC had made a grab for territory right up to the Saudi border. And the Saudis then reacted very quickly against this. And they carried out a massive bombardment in January, bombing huge amounts of Emirati material equipment. And then the Emiratis were forced to surrender basically and withdraw from the country. And then they invited the leaders of the Southern Transitional Council to come for peace negotiations in Saudi Arabia. Peace negotiations under these conditions, under these terms, would be gunpoint negotiations. And in fact, the majority of the leadership went there. The president of the STC actually fled. He was meant to get on a flight to Saudi Arabia. He got on a boat to Somaliland, and he was declared an outlaw. But he was probably quite wise not to entrust himself to the Saudis, knowing what they've done to people in the past. And when they got there, their phones were turned off. No one could contact them for a few days. And then they announced that the negotiations had successfully ended in their decision to dissolve the STC. So, first of all, this is how international diplomacy is being conducted these days. And the Americans are setting the tone, I kind of feel like in the past year, 2025, 2026, what you've had is a complete stripping away of any sense of, obviously, the liberal rules-based order, the idea that we uphold this peace and fairness and justice. They've been replaced with kidnappings, with gunboat diplomacy, with piracy on the high seas. This is how diplomacy is being carried out by America and by its proxies. Now, this is how things started in Yemen. It didn't really hit the headlines, but since then, UAE and Saudi Arabia have there's been a complete frosting over of their relationship. Both sent diplomats to America to try and lobby support from America. And since then, what you've seen is in one country after another, where, as I said previously, there's all these proxy conflicts going on, border disputes, all of this that is barbarism that has been created by the imperialists themselves, and in which different allies of the US are involved in one way or another. Those conflicts have started to line up. Israel recognized Somaliland, the breakaway from Somalia, in December. And then Qatar and Saudi Arabia signed military pacts with Somalia in opposition to that, and Pakistan sold loads of weapons to Somalia. In Libya, in Syria, where the regime is supported by Turkey and Saudi Arabia and opposed by Israel and the United Arab Emirates, all the way across to Morocco and Algeria. There's been a dispute heating up there, in which Morocco is backed by the Emiratis and the Israelis, Algeria by Turkey and the Saudis, all the way to the Indian subcontinent, where Pakistan and India are also choosing sides. You see this enormous division which has opened, in which you have American allies on either side. So from this small thing, you have this sudden polarization is taking place, in which you have India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and their allies on one side, and then on the other, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan and their allies on the other side, and it's very rapidly starting to crystallize into these two hostile military camps.
Yeah, I mean, just on Yemen, the development there is quite clear, because what happened was there was a revolution in Yemen after the Arab Revolution. The Yemeni dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power for 30 years, he was a Saudi puppet. He was overthrown by revolutionary movement. The vacuum, the political force that got in power then was the Houthis, basically, because there wasn't any other kind of working class revolutionary force. So the power ended up in the hands of the Houthis, who were closer to Iran. The Saudis didn't like that. They started a war on Yemen through all sorts of means. Actually, the overthrown president, then aligned with the Houthis. That's an entirely different thing. The Saudis then formed another coalition. The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, together with the Obama. This is one of Obama's wars that we don't talk about so much. Together with the Obama administration and Britain, waged a brutal aerial war on Yemen, destroying hospitals, schools, roads, internal infrastructure, while on the ground leaning on a coalition of forces, who were nationalists. Some of them were old leftists. There were Al-Qaeda there. There were tribes, there were all sorts of people they could find. And they got the kind of southern and eastern desert areas of the country, whereas Sana'a, the main area, was dominated by the Houthis, who had full support in those areas, and they maintained there. The point was the Saudis don't have an army because no Saudi really wants to fight for their country. They could bomb from above, with American support, with the British support, and on the ground they were leaning on these people, who were led primarily by the United Arab Emirates, who had their own mercenaries on the ground. But once the dust started settling, the clash started appearing between who would control Yemen. Obviously, the Saudis wanted to control that government, but the Emiratis were saying, well, we were actually the ones who were conducting the war on the ground, and we want to be in power. And so that then started to explode from there. Sudan was involved back then. The RSF, this militia who's now, this child militia who's now committing all sorts of atrocities. They were brought in, again, with the full knowledge of the Americans and the British and the West, to fight on the ground by the United Arab Emirates. And now, by the way, the United Arab Emirates supports the RSF side in the Sudanese civil war.
Yeah, the slaughter going on.
So from there, you could already see the outlines and the complicity of the West.
Yes.
I
think that's the key thing in this. Is that who has backed, funded, armed all of these sides that are now fighting each other, who has encouraged them politically and so forth? It has been US imperialism. I mean, right now, Israel and Turkey are facing each other as hostile opponents in Syria. Turkey supports the regime. Israel and the Emiratis are against it. It was the Americans that gave the green light.
Sudan.
In Sudan, I mean, like you say, in Sudan, what you had to begin with was a revolution in 2019, where the masses could have taken power, and these gangs of tribesmen, the Janjaweeds, which had committed genocidal acts in Darfur, were rebranded as the Rapid Support Force, I think, and they were brought into the city whilst the people while the revolution was ongoing. They were brought into Khartoum and other places, and then they were slaughtered. Mass slaughter took place, and now those counter-revolutionary gangs have come into conflict with with the army, with the official armed forces.
Who back then were the allies?
Yeah, they were allies together. They were allies, and of course they were armed, and they were the allies of Western imperialism and so forth. The RSF and the Sudanese army, where did they get their weapons and money and so forth from? They got them from the West. And now both sides are fighting each other over the carcass of the Sudanese nation, which has been torn apart.
Yeah.
And to this day, now into this barbaric civil war, where the Sudanese people have no vested interest on either side. You have on the one hand, the Saudis and Pakistan and other countries backing the Sudanese army. On the other hand, you have Israel is quietly sort of involved, but UAE is more explicitly involved. And now Ethiopia, I talked about this alignment, just in the last week, it's been proven by satellite imagery that Ethiopia is building RSF training camps on its own territory. So in other words, huge amounts of petrol are being poured onto this already horrific situation.
Yeah.
And the West is still involved in it. Britain, for example, has actually, despite the horrors being carried out by the RSF, they've been lobbying for the press to quieten down on their criticism of the RSF,
because they're selling weapons, British
weapons
weapons
to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to all of these different sides. I mean, Trump was in the Gulf just a few months ago, and he sold I think $100 billion worth of weapons. These are now being used to arm up proxies. He's also sold weapons to the Israelis. They're arming their proxies with the same at the same time.
I think, if we take a step back and see what's going on, I mean, Trump was elected as the president of peace. He's desperate to be called,
peace prize.
Get that peace prize. He was elected by opposing forever wars. By opposing the doctrine of American foreign policy that said, we never withdraw, we always double down, we must rule every inch of the world. He came out and said that is wrong. That has led America into a dead end. That has led to a crisis in America. He did it for his own reasons, but he was right. He said Biden was the worst president ever. He was probably right about that as well, until himself at least. And he said he would end the war in Gaza. He wouldn't give Netanyahu all the support that he needed. He would end the war in Ukraine. He would, but actually, he's done the exact opposite. He has continued the same line of action as every American president before him. He's backed Netanyahu to the hilt. He might have done a bit of oomph and arms and, maybe complained a little bit. But the bottom line is he's given him all the arms that he wanted. He's attacked Iran, which no other president would wanted to do before him. He's given the green light for Israel to attack Lebanon, to attack Syria, to attack Yemen, to attack everyone around them, anyone they wish, given them full support. As a result of this policy, not just Trump's policy, but the policy of American imperialism, what has happened now is, Iran has been partially weakened in certain areas. It's clearly been weakened in Syria. It's been expelled from Syria. It's clearly been weakened in Lebanon. And in general, the regime has an economic crisis and so on. But what has that led to? That's led to a situation where Israel is barging ahead, and that is destabilizing the entire region. This is pitting them against Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who are now seeing this unimpeded expansion of Israel as a major threat, and who are taking aims and who are taking measures to stop it. And that means that this conflict between these reactionary forces is now reflecting itself in all of these little countries who have their own brewing internal reasons for their conflicts, but each side in those conflicts are being dragged into one side or another of this. And here that's where you have the fault lines that you explain. But it's down to precisely the policy of American imperialism, which has not been, we are the more reasonable American. We measure our resources. That's what some of them want to do, but in reality, they've continued the exact same policy, and they're now continuing it with Iran. If they go ahead and do an attack, that will just double or magnify this process yet again, again adding to the instability, adding to the turmoil, and the resulting barbarism that will come out of this.
Yeah, I think. I mean, first of all, I just want to say something about just one word on the horrors of this situation. I mean, Yemen is the second poorest country in the world. I think Somalia is like the sixth poorest country in the world. These are and these different national questions and so forth, they're just small change in these machinations of these bigger regional powers, and behind them the major imperialist powers.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to say, well, two things. I think the first is that Trump had talked about in his national security strategy document, and I think we should make a mention of that.
Yeah.
He had laid out a whole, or whoever the author was, had laid out a whole plan for the Middle East. And that plan was essentially that the Middle East isn't as important as it was because we're now energy independent compared to in the past. And that we basically, that the region is emerging as a place of partnership, friendship, and investment, which I thought was an extremely ironic comment on the real situation. But I think there is a viewpoint amongst some in the administration that if Iran is taken out, and the document talks about the weakening of Iran, and I think that that's one place where they've massively overestimated the real state of play. But if they could just clean up the situation with Iran, get Iran out of the picture, then what you have left is just basically our allies, Israel on the one hand, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. If we could just get them together and communicate together, and then they can cooperate in the joint exploitation of the region in our interests, and Israel will be the dominant party in that. And that was the idea, I think, behind the Abraham Accords, normalize relations with Israel. And they made some progress back in 2020 during his first administration, Trump's first term. But I think that, that obviously the 7th of October has completely transformed things. It cut across that process. And it's the irony is it's actually precisely what was meant to unite the region in the interests of US imperialism that could continue dominating it, has actually now drawn a line of conflict between the different allies of US imperialism. But behind that as well, just one final thing is, I think there's also the conflict of US imperialism and China to some extent, detectable in this. On the one hand, the US, and this is part of the reason for the alarm, like we say, of the Saudis and the Turks, that the US has fully been lock, stock and barrel behind Israeli imperialism. And on the other, the weakening of US imperialism as a world hegemon has led others to hedge their bets, Turkey and the Saudis, for example, to foster relations with China, with Russia. And the whole region, if you think about the Red Sea, it's a key artery for world trade. And China has designs, it's part of its New Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative. And that's also making other powers like India increasingly nervous about will they be able to have access to the Red Sea without having to go through Chinese infrastructure and so forth. And so I think behind this, although both sides are US allies, there is also the worldwide conflict which is taking place and is defining our entire era between US and Chinese imperialism.
As the crisis of world capitalism deepens, as the crisis of American capitalism deepens, while it lashes out, in a state of weakness, is lashing out. You see less and less room for independence in reality. It's true that before all of these were under the umbrella of American imperialism, and now they have a certain independence. But at the same time, in that independence is only partial because they must gravitate into one camp or the other on a world scale. Just like on a regional scale, all of these smaller countries are actually disappearing as independent nations in the clash between the major powers. And that is a consequence of the increased tension between the nations, which is a result of the crisis of capitalism. The system is going into a crisis, and the thieves are scrambling for the loot, which means that the little thieves have to obey and abide, and the big ones are going to fight it out. And obviously, the world's populations are going to pay the price. That's not necessarily going to be the end of it, though, because you see, we're painting out. There are two trends here. There are two trends. One trend is of capitalism as a system going towards barbarism. All of the things that you mentioned, we didn't even have time to go in, but we see elements of barbarism. This system that was supposed to civilize the entire planet is causing the most horrific barbarism for huge swathes of it. But at the same time, this is politicizing people. This
Oh,
is
yeah.
waking a lot of people up in the US itself, in the West, all over the world. People are looking at this and they are repulsed by the system. And we're going to talk about that in our next segment.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that just as much as US imperialism in its, I don't know if we can say decline yet, but in this declining phase, let's put it like that, is dragging the world down, is also causing a counter reaction to it, as more and more people realize the incredibly reactionary nature that it plays and the system that it represents plays.
Yeah. No, as I said before, I feel like 2008 had played a bit of a role in consciousness insofar as pre 2008 the attitudes towards the bankers, the official one, what the politicians would say in the press was that they're the wealth creators, they're these wonderful assets to society. After 2008, they became regarded as parasites and an absolutely atrocious mob. The events of 2025, 2026, both world politics and what's been going on there, and also what we're seeing, I think, with the Epstein scandal, is exposing politicians and the whole ruling class in a similar sort of way. Rather than they always talk about, they stand for human rights and law and peace and progress and so forth. In actual fact, their conduct on the world scale and their conduct at home as well is revealing them to be a bunch of predatory gangsters that are out for themselves and what they can grab. And I think, in many ways, Trump is the condensed essence of that.
He is
himself,
and he's accelerating the process,
radicalizing people.
I think that's a good. I mean, you made a segue there.
Yeah.
But we can announce it now. I think we're gonna end the previous segment. I mean, this is a conflict that's brewing. It's gonna go on for the foreseeable future, and we'll be coming back to it.
Yes.
It's obviously a very important part of world politics. But another very important part of world politics today is the Epstein scandal. This is the biggest scandal in world history, probably, we can say.
I would say so.
Because it is so incredibly wide in the damage that is done to the system, in the people that is implicated from all over the world, from almost every single country or a huge number of countries, and the layers of the establishment that it is embroiled. And it's going to be a festering kind of wound that's just going to bring up more and more disgust amongst ordinary people for the establishment. Now, in Britain, the major fallout at this point has been the arrest of Lord Mandelson, former minister, former ambassador to the US, and Andrew, formerly known as Prince. I just want to say we coined that term first. But yeah, it's funny, but actually it's not, because there's so much rot in this case, and it's rightfully caused a huge amount of disgust amongst people, which is why they have had to take certain measures. They had to arrest these guys. They had to throw them under the bus, in other words, because the rage and anger on the ground is such that if they didn't do anything, they could be faced with huge repercussions for the system. But that doesn't mean that those repercussions are not coming yet.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to read some bits. There's a very, very interesting article in the Times. The article is called "The Establishment Has Been Rocked Before. Epstein is an Existential Threat." And I believe this was in the Sunday Times, which is obviously one of the
Tory paper, yeah.
Tory paper, conservative, huge. This is one of the institutions of British capitalism that writes this in the Sunday edition, which is, again, another institution within that. On the 21st of February by Robert Vekaik. And I'm going to read a significant chunk of it to begin with. And then we'll go in. There's a few bits here. It says, "The prospect of the former prince, who for now remains eighth in line to the throne, standing on the dock of an English crown court that bears his brother's coats of arms, while detectives continue to extend their investigation across the royal estate, is likely to ignite a constitutional crisis that the royal family cannot survive. Number one, this is a constitutional crisis that the royal family may not, or according to these guys, cannot survive. For the tax-paying public watching aghast, it is hard not to sense a decades-long conspiracy of silence and self-interested self-protection, as well as a strong whiff of rotten corruption at the heart of the state. Yes, it's not that they don't sense it. It is a fact that there's been a decades-long, centuries-long conspiracy. In this country, the establishment is the institutions that control the wealth of the nation and govern and influence the people. It is the politicians, the bankers, the police, the legal profession, and the civil service, among others. In other words, it's what we call the regime, right? It is the people who carry out the rule of the ruling class, which is the capitalist class, the big business, banks, and so on and so forth. Many of them go about their business in the name of the crown. In recent years, all these institutions have been rocked by scandal and controversy, from the bailout of the banks in the 2008 financial crisis to the wrongful conviction of Andrew Malkinson, who spent 17 years in prison for rape, to the shameful post office scandal. Individually, these proved to be crises that each institution was able to withstand. But the Epstein scandal is on a different scale because it linked together in the public perception trusted and respected figures from the top of all these institutions. The private emails to and from the accounts of Epstein reveal how the so-called great and the good behave when their guard is down and have found them to be, at the very least, biddable or motivated by sex and greed rather than the high values they like to talk about in public. It's much more than mere hypocrisy. Let's just hold it there and just dwell on those words. We could have written these words.
They wrote it better than I could have written it. I wouldn't have anything else
because
to add.
They're terrified. They're talking about their system. They know what the establishment is.
They know it very well, yeah.
Any ruling class needs its enforcers. Part of that is the police, the army. That is the violent enforcement of its rule. But you can't enforce yourself. You can't maintain yourself by violence alone. You need to have a coterie, a whole system, a machine that seamlessly maintains your interests and absorbs and kind of maneuvers around any challenge that you may have. The entirety of that machine is now being exposed in the eyes of the masses.
Yeah. No, absolutely. This is revolutionary stuff, the Epstein stuff. Much lesser scandals have had a potentially revolutionary impact. Lenin said, actually, of the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s, I believe, a Jewish officer, one of many Jewish officers, suffered one of many anti-Semitic acts. He was framed.
This was in France.
This was in France. Sorry, yes, of course, it was in France. And he was put on trial. This trial was pushed forward by reactionary, monarchist, anti-Semitic officers, and he was wrongfully convicted of treason, I believe. And this caused outrage. Particularly celebrated figures like Emile Zola took up this case, and Lenin even thought that this could lead to revolution or civil war in France at that time. And the only way, actually, that the French ruling class managed to get themselves out of that situation was by bringing for the first time in history, actually, a socialist minister was brought into government to act as a shield against the anger of the masses. And they invented this idea of a Republican front against the reactionary, rotten, right-wing monarchists. We need an alliance of the progressive capitalist class and the workers' parties. But here, this isn't one section of the capitalist class that's exposed. It's the whole lot of them. I mean, you look in the Epstein files and so forth. You have, on the far right, you have Steve Bannon. On the left, you have people like Chomsky. You have royalty. You have civil servants, ministers, Just the other day, a former prime minister of Norway tried to kill himself because he's been named in the Epstein files.
Yeah.
We were talking about what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The owner or the CEO of the Emirati group that owns the main port in Somaliland, which is such a big factor in this situation, has had to resign because he's named, and all sorts of disgusting emails have come out.
Saudi princes.
Oh, on the other side, yeah.
Ehud Barak,
Ehud Barak,
the former Israeli prime minister.
Yeah, the politicians involved in negotiating the Oslo Accords and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland are also involved. Like, this is, the whole establishment, literally the whole establishment. None of them emerged from this unscathed, and this is going to continue for years. Not least because they're still covering it up. They've only released half of the files. And it's just come out today that some specifically involving Trump
has been kept back.
Allegations of abuse have been kept back, and this is going to roll on, and it has enormous implications.
Yeah, we shouldn't remember. Last year we had all of the Gen Z revolutions. A big part of the Gen Z revolutions were the question of corruption.
Yeah,
and it's not a secondary thing. For anyone who thinks it is, they're completely wrong. Moral indignation is an important factor in history because that's when people realize we do not have the same interests as the people who are ruling us. And I think that's what's becoming clear. The Epstein files, they implicate everyone. The business elite, the political elite, the cultural elite, and the intellectual elite, the academia.
Yeah,
all of the, and the way that they talk with each other, I mean, it's second nature to them. You don't feel like the propositions that Epstein make, not just about sexual abuse, but about businesses and the way that they bend the system to their own benefit. This is how they talk amongst themselves. Yeah. This is class solidarity. This is how the ruling class and the establishments talks about themselves. But it shows their morality. And it shows their indignation and lack of and feeling of impunity and all-powerfulness and omnipotence above other people. But at the same time, it activates a class anger the other way around, a class indignation, which can have revolutionary consequences. And I'll tell you, I'm just going to read some of the final lines of this article. It says, "The establishment is only allowed to run the country because it enjoys the trust of the British people, who in turn want to believe no one is above the law and that law officers must be allowed to proceed without fear or favor. And with so many files redacted and held back, there is little faith that we will get to the bottom of the scandal and identify all those involved. Confidence in our institutions is at an all-time low. While Gen Z and millennials are showing what they think of the establishment by turning to social media influencers for their values and role models. The Epstein files have fatally undermined public confidence and trust in the establishment, and in particular, trust in the House of Windsor, which in Britain today is obviously a huge part of the ruling class. It's the center point of the ruling class." And then it ends. These are the final words. "The monarchy sits at the top of the establishment, and would it collapse under the weight of a criminal investigation, then the whole edifice will come crashing down."
Whole establishment.
These are words of warning. These are revolutionary conclusions that the ruling class is drawing by looking at, not that they're revolutionaries, but they're concluding the revolutionary consequences of what is going on.
Yes.
And that is a fact. And I think this is the key thing I want to end with. What we're going to take away from this episode. We talk about all of the barbarism. Look at the barbarism that Epstein was a part of. That goes on all the time in all layers of the ruling class and in many, many different forms that we don't even see in these files. The barbarism and the violence in the Middle East and in all of these imperialist wars and conflicts. The barbarism of everyday subjugation of ordinary people. The barbarism that you constantly feeling like you can't breathe and you have to go to work and you're being worn out, you're getting tired out. The violence of unemployment, the violence of price hikes, which is a threat to ordinary people's health and sanity. all of that is a part of the capitalist class, and that is one part of the process. But all of that has an equal reaction in the other part. I wanted to find a bit. I can't find it here, but there is a bit in Faust. Now, some of us have been reading Faust recently, and Faust is a book by a great German author called Goethe, and Faust is the spirit of negation. He's like a devil. But he says, look, it doesn't matter how much I throw at humanity, they always bounce back. And that's the point, that all of this hardship, yeah, is terrible. That is actually the true nature of the capitalist system. But what's different this time around is that people are waking up, and this is radicalizing them. And out of this barbaric situation, there are two trends developing. One moving towards barbarism, and with equal force, there's another trend appearing, which is towards revolution and towards a sustained, decisive movement against this ruling class, which is dragging us all down into the rot.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was my final words. Do you have anything else to say before?
Any final words on the Epstein situation? I mean, actually, Fred Weston, who is often a guest on this podcast.
Host. We have no guests here.
Oh, there are no guests. We're all hosts. Okay. He's often on this podcast, and he was saying the other day, you can see how this has developed for the ruling class. They, in the 1980s, you had the defeats that the working class suffered. In 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and after that, the labor movement was on its back. The right-wing bureaucrats, rose to the top, and they were never going to challenge the ruling class.
Yeah.
So they'd won, and they were completely unchallenged and unchallengeable in their minds. And so they went ahead and they had complete impunity. They could do what they want, and that wasn't just reflected in exploiting and ransacking the world and so on. It was also reflected in how they treated these young women and everything else. This really is it's the hubris of the ruling class that had won, and they thought they could get away with anything, use people however they wanted, because they were going to get away with it and they were going to continue. But now we're seeing, I don't think it's a coincidence. This has been going on since the 80s up until the 2000s,
Well, it's always been going on.
It's always been going on. Okay, but this specific scandal has been going on for years. But now, I mean, we already knew about what he was doing in Palm Beach, but now it's all coming to the surface because there is this anger which is developing in society, this huge amount of anger, this questioning, this searching attitude towards the whole establishment amongst millions of people who are finding it rotten and disgusting. That's why, what Trump is saying now, he's saying, we should be focusing on the fact that the Dow is over 50,000. It's never been over 50,000 before.
The rich are making more money than ever before.
All that sounds like to ordinary people is, you're making loads of money, and why are you talking about? Previously, he was like Teflon, but now this is all catching up with him. He can't use that playbook anymore. Oh, they want to distract from how wonderful I am. Yeah. No, you're part of that's. Why is it Epstein that has catalyzed all of this anger? There's the economy, there's all these foreign interventions, but it's the Epstein question that I think has catalyzed this in the United States, because it makes something click. Right, it makes sense to the MAGA base, the working class people that voted for him. Of course, he's not carried out his program because he's one of them. He's part of the ruling class. He's part of that elite.
Part of the Epstein class.
He's part of the Epstein class. Yeah, so everything else makes sense, I think.
Exactly. Pride comes before the fall. Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you were talking, and that's happened to American imperialism. Their pride is dragging them down further and further and further, obviously at the cost of the rest of the world, but also for the ruling class. Their pride and sense of impunity makes them do even more openly and more, obscenely, brazenly all of these crimes. But that's precisely what's also preparing a massive backlash by ordinary people. I think that's a good place to end it for today. Again, an ongoing case that will follow. But we have one last question that we'll try to answer, which is something we've met with often. Do communists support violence?
Well, Ted Grant, who's the founder of our organization, he was asked this. Do you communists support violent revolution? And he just answers with a rhetorical question. Do we support the Black Death? Is that what you're asking? Like,
Yeah.
when they ask us this, no one is in favor of violence. No one, or at least no normal, right-minded and decent person is in favor of violence. Of course not. And what they're trying to do is put us in the dock, the defenders of the ruling class, and say, you see, these people are in favor of our system may be terrible, and everything, but these people are in favor of a violent revolution. And what we're saying, we turn that question around completely and put them in the dock.
Yeah.
Actually, no, your system is guilty of tremendous violence. We don't want violence. We're not in favor of violence, but this system is permanent, unending violence. There's what we were talking about in your final remarks about Epstein. There is the passive violence of forcing people to work long night shifts is going to cause them to go to an early grave.
Yeah.
Forcing people to subsist on insufficient nutrition is going to send them to an early grave. The lack of maternity care that millions of people have around the world leads to thousands of preventable deaths every year as a result in childbirth, which is completely unnecessary in the 21st century. And then there is the violence actually being perpetrated in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Sudan. And Sudan, I think, is a good place to actually address this question, because the violence we are seeing now in Sudan is precisely a result of the fact that the revolution which unfolded from 2019, which could have put an end to capitalism in Sudan, which could have led to the masses seizing power, was not successful. And the result has been absolute barbarism, the devastation of the country, the descent into this civil war between two counter-revolutionary gangs.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, just to interrupt you, sorry, I remember there was the Sudanese revolution of 2019 was one of the most powerful revolutions of the past 20 years. And it peaked with the two massive general strikes, which completely halted all production and economic activity in the country. The entire state apparatus was on strike and not abiding by what the government told it. So in de facto, power was in the hands of the strike committee, of the masses. The ports, the factories, shops, everything. Vast majority of the population supported the revolution against the old regime, which was in bed with all sorts of people, including the West. But actually, the revolution, because it was in a naive way and being anti-violence, said, no, we don't want to take arms. We don't want to do anything like that. And it didn't in any way try to win over the ranks of the army. Yeah. The ranks of the army were with the revolution.
That's why they had to bring in the RSF.
What happened was that they had these camps in front of the Ministry of Defense. And during the night, they brought in the RSF, Janjaweed militias, and they killed hundreds and hundreds of them. And they then embarked on a campaign of terror, and which eventually led us to this point, where with hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of people being uprooted, and the entire country stopping existing, and the entire population having to endure barbarism for the foreseeable future. So that was the barbarism of the ruling class, who will not shy away from anything to maintain its rule. The mistake of the Sudanese revolution was not to understand that. You see, if they had made a political campaign to win over the ranks of the soldiers, say, come over to the side of the revolution, organize yourself democratically, elect your own leaders, be a part of the revolutionary process, and be a part of the revolutionary new revolutionary power of the country, there would have been no bloodshed, because none of these RSFs couldn't even, they couldn't get gas, they couldn't go through the country, they couldn't do anything, and they would have been met with a defensive force. And because they failed to defend themselves, this is the situation that the country ended up in. The Russian Revolution, incidentally, in St. Petersburg, was a handful of people died. Why? Because the revolution, and that wasn't because of the revolutionaries, but because of the counter-revolution. Most of the people who died after the Russian Revolution was not because the communists were exterminating people, but because 21 armies were attacking Soviet Russia, where the working class had taken power for the first time in 1917, in order to wrest that power away from them. Because they knew that it posed a threat to all capitalist regimes all over the world. So that is, I think, the main answer. We are not in favor of violence. The ruling class is the main fomenter of violence, but the working class needs to defend itself. And if it doesn't, then the violence of the ruling class will prevail.
Yeah, I think it's quite timely actually in France right now. There's the right wing and the ruling class are whipping up a lot of hysteria against the left and France Insoumise, Mélenchon's party, and they're accusing the left of being violent because in a clash between, by the way, far-right neo-Nazi groups and some left-wing youth, one neo-Nazi was killed. But if you actually look at the statistics, 9/10 of political deaths in France are caused by the far right. They are the ones carrying out these attacks and so forth. But the ruling class has always, the Romans had a slogan: "Woe to the vanquished." If revolutions aren't successful, it's counter-revolutions which are overwhelmingly the violent events in history. And particularly in countries like Britain, the US, and so forth, where the working class is the overwhelming majority in society, where the ranks of the army are also the sons and daughters of working class families. It is if the masses have a clear political leadership and are prepared to act decisively to carry out the revolutionary overthrow of the existing system, then there's no force on earth that can stop the working class. And in fact, that's absolutely necessary to stop the violence. The descent into barbarism, the outlines of which we've illustrated in the Middle East, could engulf our species. The only way to avoid that violence, that atrocious reactionary violence, is precisely to decisively overthrow the system.
I think those are perfect words to end the episode on today. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. By the way, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and also write your questions in the comments. We look at them. We try to answer as many as we can. If you have questions, if you're not a communist, even better, I would almost say, because we want to answer critical questions as much as friendly ones. If you have friends who are not communists and who are very critical and who have very sharp questions, write it in the comment sections, write it in our social media posts. We'll try to answer them here. We will be back next Thursday, 6 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone.